Sorensen family members are not the only Albertans calling for mandatory minimum sentences in cases of hit and run causing severe injury or death. Their petition has already gathered nearly 10,000 signatures. It's a response that raises the question, do stiffer penalties bring justice for victims? And joining us now to explore that line of thought, criminal defense lawyer Rod Gregory and Doug King, professor of justice studies at Mount Royal University. Good evening, gentlemen. Welcome back to Alberta Primetime. Great to see you both.
Thank you.
All right, to provide a little bit of context for this conversation, the Calgary Police Service provided us with some statistics. 75 hit and run collisions were reported in that city in 2014, 17 involving injuries, and the numbers are already showing an increase this year. As of August, there were 24 hit and run collisions where someone was injured. So Rod, we'll start with you. What does this say about the need for mandatory minimum sentences?
Well, Michael, you probably know I'm always against mandatory minimum sentences.
But tell us. I know we've talked about this on the crime panel before, but tell us why.
Well, I'm not alone in that opinion, and in the criminal justice system, I think universally prosecutors and judges are generally not in favor of mandatory minimum sentences because it takes away the discretion of the sentencing judge in a case where a person should not receive that mandatory minimum sentence. And the Supreme Court of Canada has struck down some of those mandatory minimum sentences recently in relation to firearms. So the flip side of the mandatory minimum sentence is that hit and run causing death has a maximum sentence of life imprisonment. So the consequences for these offenses can be very, very severe.
But how likely is it, though, that someone would actually be given life in prison?
Well, life imprisonment would be reserved for the worst offender in the worst circumstances. So someone with a very, very long criminal record involved in a hit and run that might cause multiple fatalities would receive a sentence that might mirror a manslaughter or second-degree murder case. So anecdotally, my experience is that the prosecutors who I come across in these cases take hit and run cases very, very seriously.
Okay, Doug, where do you stand on mandatory minimums?
I'm much of the same opinion that Rod is. Because I don't work in the system on a day-to-day basis, I tend to be looking at it more from an observer perspective. And when, first of all, I think when we hear the passion and the hurt of victims and the families of victims, we have to, one, pay attention to it. But we also have to try and understand where those issues are coming from. I personally believe that the call for more mandatory minimum sentences, not just in what we call hit and run, but in other kinds of offenses, are largely coming out of increasing problems within the criminal justice system in the sense of, Crown prosecutors overcharging accused individuals in order to get a plea deal, and then agreeing to the plea deal, and now all of a sudden the victims and the families of the victims are wondering, well, what happened here? So I look at it from that perspective. I also agree that there is nothing wrong with giving judges discretion. I mean, that's the basis of our entire system. And to try and take that away tends to smack a little too much of, why don't we just put the circumstances into a computer, press a button, and get a sentence. So I do think that the call for mandatory minimum sentences is largely a symptom of a system that is not working appropriately. And from my perspective, that's because it's largely underfunded. There aren't enough judges, there aren't enough Crown prosecutors to do the job that needs to be done effectively. And when that happens, invariably, it's the victims that come out feeling like the system didn't work.
Doug, now, depending on the severity of the hit and run, wide range of sentencing options. Maybe walk us through the scope of what could be handed out.
Well, hopefully Rod will be able to join in and change, or correct me when I'm wrong. But there are, in essence, 3 different levels of offenses. There's failing to stop at the scene of an accident. That can lead to a summary conviction offense with a maximum penalty of 6 months or a fine of $5,000. It can also be processed as an indictable offense, which then can get you the maximum of 5 years in prison. If there is bodily harm involved in the accident, and it is very important to understand this, and the individual who leaves the scene of the accident knows that there's bodily harm involved, then that escalates it to an offense of no more than 10 years in prison. And then if the person leaves the scene of the crime and that the victim is dead and that the individual who's leaving the scene is knowingly is leaving the scene with that situation in mind, that is life in prison. So, again, it's Rod will be much more able to speak to this. That notion of being able to know that harm has occurred is crucial when the charge is actually laid.
Okay, I want to reflect on the point that the mom in the story what we watched just a moment ago, obviously dissatisfied with charges brought forward against the woman guilty in this hit and run collision. Rod, is that your experience, that that's how victims' families respond, or are people satisfied that justice is being done based on the sentences currently available?
Well, I agree that, the criminal justice system has to take into account what happens to victims in crime. And the federal government has put sections in the criminal code to acknowledge that and give more of a voice to victims. I think the difficulty is that there are some cases and some crimes where nothing brings back a loved one, and no sentence really can satisfy family members. And it's understandable that they would think that way, and we understand why they want to get a petition, and they don't think what happened in the justice system was right. But we just can't fix certain things that happen in society.
Now, we reached out to the Minister of Justice for her opinion on whether tougher sentences are needed. In a written statement, Kathleen Ganley had this to say: "One of my key priorities is to ensure that adequate and effective policing is maintained throughout the province. We also work with the Ministry of Transportation on road safety and safer driving campaigns. Our efforts aim to reduce the number of drinking and driving incidents, which in turn can help reduce the number of hit and runs." Following up on what the minister mentioned, often in cases of hit and run, drivers are impaired, fleeing the scene because they simply don't want to be found behind the wheel drunk. Doug, if not tougher sentences, how do we stop people from taking off in those incidents?
With respect to the minister's statement, one good step is to avoid political double talk. Her statement didn't actually indicate anything prescriptive or what was intended on doing. We all agree that we have to try and eliminate these kinds of traffic offenses, particularly those that cause death. I mean, that's a given. The reality, though, when it comes to things like impaired driving and failing to leave the scene of crime, is largely issues of education and intervention and those kinds of things. The Government of Canada has put out its own research on this, and they rarely talk about this because it doesn't serve a political end. That if you take two people who are identical and have committed the same criminal code offense but are identical in exactly the same areas, criminal history, demographic backgrounds, and you give one a longer sentence than another in a federal institution, the person that actually serves more time in prison has a greater likelihood of reoffending again when they get out. So prison's not the answer. The answer is actually providing much more support and funding for things that tackle the causes of criminality, and those can be many things ranging from substance abuse issues and things like that. Tough on crime in that approach that largely has failed in the United States, which they acknowledge readily and are moving away from it. In most states, even states like Georgia and that, are moving away from tougher sentences and things like that. Tough on crime hasn't worked in Canada, and there will be a time when we realize that it's probably too costly to be sending people to prison without the likelihood of impacting on why they committed the crime to begin with.
Rod, we viewers, regular viewers, especially of the Crime Panel, know where you stand on tough on crime. What about the education aspect? Is that enough incentive to keep people from driving away?
Well, Doug makes an excellent point. What the federal government had budgeted for increased prisons was in the billions. And if we had that money going to alcohol abuse, drug abuse, and preventative programs in the community, starting with young people, our crime rate would go down. So let's shift, let's be proactive instead of reactive as it relates to things that happen in our society.
Doug, maybe as a final thought, what do Albertans need to take away from this conversation? Obviously, there are Albertans out there who are hurting because of the position they've been left in. But how do we answer to that?
You know, one cannot feel compassion for the Sorensen family. What they've gone through is something that no family should have to go through. My sense is that their interest in minimum mandatory sentences is a good faith idea that they hope would help people not experience the same pain that they've experienced. I come back to this. I don't think the criminal justice system is being transparent enough. I think the Crown prosecutor in the case should have been able to sit with the Sorensen family and say, this is why we're doing what we're doing. Again, Rod may be able to weigh in on this, but when we engage in overcharging of an accused in order to kind of put pressure on them to plead guilty to an offense, may seem like an efficient use of the system, but it continues to damage the victims if they are not told what is happening. And so it all comes down to let's be a little bit more transparent in how the criminal justice system works, and I think we will be able to move forward.
Rod, last word to you.
Well, I completely agree with that. And when we talk about the resources in the criminal justice system, the number of judges, the number of prosecutors, prosecutors quite often cannot even speak to victims or witnesses until the day of trial, because they're in court 20 days in a row, however many days in a row, and they have so many trials. They would love to be able to sit down with people ahead of time and say, this is what's happening, but it's very, very difficult for them to do that.
Gentlemen, very much appreciate your perspectives on this evening. Thank you very kindly.